Mr. Avik Chanda. His recent novel is Anger, which has just been released on the 13th of January in Kolkata and was featured on the 17th of January in the Kolkata Literary Festival. It has also been featured in newspapers like the Business Standard, the Financial Express, and just today on the Telegraph. It's a political thriller which has a very exciting narrative, and we'll be inviting him today to give you a little more briefing about the book. And we'll have one of our students asking him a few questions and have an interactive session with him. After which we will also open the session to questions from you, and you can all interact with him. And at the end of the session, he will be giving away a few signed copies of his book. So hope you all enjoy it. And I now welcome him up on the dais. Prasanna Malvika Rajagopalan will be with him, and she will be conducting the session along with him.
Alright, so thanks for that glowing introduction, and thank you all. So before I launch into my pitch, I just wanted to thank the organizers here at Verba Maximus for inviting me over, particularly because it was a bit of a last-minute slot. And we were here yesterday, and I have to say that I enjoyed. We were here for almost 2 hours, 3 hours, right? And we didn't participate, thankfully, because I wouldn't have won any prizes. But I was lucky enough to have been part of the audience with the GD, the jam session. I think part of Putting Perspective, and I see at least a few of the participants from those sessions here today. So just wanted to thank you all very much for having me over. So quick introduction about the book. As you heard, it is a political thriller, and I'm hoping it is a thriller with a difference. So we'll talk a little bit about the book in a minute. But what I wanted to do with this book is to go away from the usual detective story genre or police story genre and do something a little bit different with the book. How many of you have been to a book launch? Okay, 1, 2. Is that 3 or is that 2.5? That's a no. That's a pause. 2. Okay. So what happens in a book launch? Do you have another mic that can go around? Or you can shout. Lung power.
The author generally sort of, promotes the book. I mean, most people sort of already know what the title is, and the author in question gives you a little bit of a teaser as to how the book is different, or how the book takes the story along, and why it's a book worth buying and worth reading.
Okay, good. Sorry, I didn't get your name.
I'm Ranjan.
Ranjan. So thanks for promoting my book, because you're wearing red. I'm wearing red, and Anchor is all red. So anyone who's wearing any tinge of red, promoting my book anyway. Okay, great. There was somebody else who had attended the book launch. I saw another hand going up. Yep.
There's what Ranjan said, that's all, and sometimes the author gives a small passage out of it.
Okay, alright, cool. So, because the book has just come out, and literally copies of the book have hit the Hyderabad store like last week, there hasn't been enough time for us to come up with a movie trailer or videos or anything of that. But I just wanted to give you guys a little flavor of what happens at some of these events. So some of these are still shots. So this is from the Calcutta Literary Fest, which happened, that's the book being launched. Reading, more reading. And that's from the actual launch, which was there on the 13th. Pretty much what you said, you have an author or somebody who's important who come in and who rip open the back and launch it, and people go clap clap. I will also play a video, a slightly longer video of the launch, which hopefully will save me some amount of introduction about the book, okay? Because typically the person who does the launch is usually obliged to talk about the book a little bit. And I was privileged because a pretty well-known, accomplished author by the name of Kunal Basu happened to launch my book. Anybody here has heard of that person? Vaguely? 1, 2, 3. Okay, fair enough. So he's written quite a few novels, including something called Japanese Wife, which was made into a movie recently. So. So I will fast forward.
Not writing about love. Which seems sort of like an oddity in itself. Okay? I mean, every film you watch, I mean, apart from the films of shown here, every film has to do about love. Every story, and I'm equally guilty. I'm equally guilty. I've written novels and short stories which are also about love. But here was this young man who wasn't. And he was writing about a world that seemed partly familiar and partly unfamiliar, which is a mark of a good story. If it is entirely familiar, then you're bored. If it is totally unfamiliar, then it's easy to grasp for known markers. So it's partly familiar, partly unfamiliar. The characters seems tangible and real. And it was more of a surprise to me, because it is difficult to write about the city where you've grown up.
All right, so we'll leave it at that. We can have videos or snippets with the organizers here, so if you want to replay some of that later. So you know what it is not about. It's not about love. So if you've come here for another, the 17th or the 70th person copying Sudeep Nagarkar, that's not what it is here. It is also not your typical police story or detective story. It is a thriller which has a lot of political underpinnings, which at least tries to be very realistic. Therefore, a thriller with a difference. So that's a little bit about the book. So I'll maybe start off with some questions and take it along.
Right. So your book has an unusual name, Anchor. What does it signify and how does it relate to your story exactly?
Okay. So the name Anchor derives from, so anyone who knows what an anchor means? Everyone should know what an anchor means.
The anchor of a ship.
Okay, so what's the purpose of the anchor of a ship? Keeping it steady, preventing it from sinking. Okay, fine. Making it, alright, stay in course, not move away, not get lost. Okay, perfect. So if you read any newspaper, the front page of any newspaper, today's newspaper, doesn't matter what day you read, there is always going to be a story right across the bottom, okay? Usually with punchy headlines, sometimes with a photograph, usually something sensational or explosive or sensitive. So that, in journalistic terms, is called an anchor. And that's where the name or the story derives its name from. And much of that is drawn from experience, because although today I do consulting for a living and it's IT and software and all that mundane stuff, when I started off my career, that was in the newsroom, doing night shifts and sifting stories and editing stories and so forth. So that's exactly what I was doing. And there's a lot of journalism back in those days in the book. So that's about it.
Right. Thank you, sir. My next question would be, the book has a number of characters from different walks of life. So how did you draw inspiration from your own life into these characters? How exactly did that happen?
Okay, well, a lot of that has to do with people I knew back then. So you're going back in time maybe 18, 20 years. and the way that news was made at that point of time, the way that journalists were doing their work at that point of time. So a lot has to do with the characters or the real life people that I met back then. And there were obviously, because you've got policemen, you've got politicians, you've got thugs. The latter I have not had the privilege to meet. But even some of the former I have not had the privilege to meet. But that's more based on my research. And I had the opportunity, because I was at one point of time part of that world. Research more recently, I was talking to reporters who were there in the field and who were covering events and asking about their experience. So I was, freely leveraging from their stories and their own experiences.
Nice. So we know that Anchor is your first novel, but it's not your first book as such. And how did you get into writing fiction? Did you start with, say, poetry or a couple of plays, or how did you get into fiction?
Okay. So let me ask the audience this, right? How many of you read poetry? Honestly. Oh my God, that's a good number. Who writes poetry? You write poetry. Good, you write poetry, and there's at least half a dozen people who read poetry. Okay. How many of you read fiction? Right. So that I think is a difference. For the longest time ever, I was writing poetry. So if I go back 10 or 12 years, I was writing poetry. Half the time I wasn't here in India, and with nothing better to do with my time, I was just reading and writing most of the time. And slowly over the years, what I did was, okay, if I'm writing, I might as well try to publish. So I got two books of poetry out. One was in my native tongue in Bengali, and the other was a UK publisher, right? And I was very happy. I was very, very happy because, okay, I've arrived and my poetry is published in journals and it's come out in books, etc. And then actually two things dawned on me. A, not too many people were actually reading my poetry. So there might have been 15, 20, 50 people, right? Or the 6 people plus one who writes poetry who've been reading that poetry. And the second thing is it didn't make any difference to the rest of the world, apart from those 20 people, that they were not reading my poetry. And so I said, this doesn't work. So if I have to write something, the ultimate purpose of it, hopefully, should be to reach out to the readers and at least reach the readers. And then I said, okay, so maybe stories work better, so maybe fiction works better. Bigger readership, huge market today, Indians writing in English and doing very well. So let me go for it.
So why the newsroom? Why that particular setting? What prompted you to take that setting as the one behind your book?
Right. So and I don't think I was going on like a big mission as such, but here's something that I thought about, maybe subconsciously, right? And that is as follows. What do news people do? What do editors do? What do journalists do? If you think about it, they turn the camera onto the world, right? And bring that to your drawing room in the morning, or bring that to your TV set. I thought, why not have a story that turns the camera inwards and shows the newsroom, shows the journalists, shows the editors, shows the reporters at work. Do it in reverse.
So, are there any questions from the audience?
Why is the color red so significant in your novel? Not that I'm asking you to give a spoiler or anything, but...
Well, I think for the most obvious reason, because the book, when you read it, is quite stark. There are things which are... So there are no Bollywood scenarios where there are supermen who change and then come out in red cloaks and go flying around and saving the world. That kind of thing doesn't happen. There are events which you will identify with, things like oppression of civil liberties and people putting pressure, and there are pretty brutal incidents. So the red is for the general tone of the book. and it is at times or many times quite violent, so therefore it's read. Plus it makes for a good cover. So I was discussing actually 3 or 4 different covers with the publisher, right? And it's not a big, oversized coffee table book. This is like a small book. So I said, okay, if there are 5 other books, right? You've got a half girlfriend, quarter boyfriend, whatever else, right? All of them with very, very different colors and all of that. And uske beech mein I have this. How does a first-time author gather the attention, gain the attention of the color?
Any other question?
When you're launching a book, you have to give out information so that you can appeal to the audience. At the same time, you also don't want to give the plot away. So how do you decide how much to tell to the people about your book?
That was actually quite easy in my case, because what was happening is, because it's a thriller, as long as you read out little passages from here and there, so you don't talk about the entire book, and you just say, right, so the novel is basically the story of one night shift. So it begins around 7:30, 7:45 on a particular given evening, like on a winter's evening. And then the next morning it ends around 5:15, 5:30 a.m. in the morning. And then you say, okay, our story picks up at 8 o'clock, and you read out a page, and then you go on, and you don't say what's happening in between. And then you say, okay, I'll pick it up again, and somebody else reads it out and says, okay, at 11 p.m., somewhere this is what happens, etc.
Any more questions?
Lots of questions, good.
Sorry.
We'll go to Mr. Jam first.
Are there any...
Sorry, I don't know your name. I just remember you from the jam session yesterday.
My name is Gopal. Are you planning any sequels or upcoming novels after this?
Not sequels. So the thing was, at that point of time, since I was writing quite prolifically, I've got another couple of manuscripts, and a part of it depends on how well this does. So if this does well, you'll see the second one coming out soon.
Sorry.
Sir, just for the sake of to be writers in the future here, how easy or difficult is it to land a publisher like HarperCollins?
It's not easy. So here's the thing, right? Here's the paradox. Today, more than ever before, you have Indians writing in English and being very successful. I can't remember ever in our history that this has happened. But paradoxically, that means that it becomes that much more difficult for the editors and the agents and the publishers to pick up something that they think is of value or something that they think will sell. Hopefully both. Right? So, I honestly don't have a formula. In my case, it was luck. Part of it was luck. Because the person who edited my book from HarperCollins was the same person who, like 6, 7, longer, 10 years ago was with Penguin and featured some of my poems in a Penguin anthology. So when he moved on to HarperCollins and I told him stories, gave him the ideas of my stories, he said, okay, give me the first 30 pages, give me the first 50 pages, and then we take it on from there, right? And so he liked them, and then he said, okay, now give me the entire book, and then we started to work on it, like bit by bit. It's a slow process. But initially, going back to your question, if I did not know this person at all, I would be just sending in my manuscript, and it would, more often than not, go into something called the slush pile, and then over a very hectic, hurried weekend, you have 2 or 3 editors sipping various, sort of multiple cups of black coffee and going through that. So that's what your chances are. But it's not as bleak as that, because sometimes what happens is, it's a question of how do you get noticed. It's a question of, are you publishing anything anywhere? So sometimes you can start off by, let's say, publishing short stories, or by publishing reviews or features that get out in a day. Right, so let's say take the dailies, take the big dailies here in Hyderabad, we're talking about a Deccan Chronicle or a Hindu or a TUI. Anything that gives you credibility. It's a little bit about building a CV. So if you send something to the publisher and say, hey, by the way, the last couple of years I have been writing features or review articles or stories or something of that sort. and they have come out in dailies or they have come out in magazines and so forth, then it can make a difference.
Anybody else?
You said that you started by writing poetry. So to you, what is more satisfying? Writing poetry that satisfies your own self, or fiction that would reach out to the public?
Both actually, except that I don't have the time to do both. So in fact, right now I'm doing neither. But I think bits of both. If you can manage to do both, that's the best thing. Don't copy anyone, please. Right? Start your own job, start your own thing. Because there are very many people who are successful, and you may like their work, you may not like their work, but you can't ignore them. And the reason why you can't is what they are doing in their own way, right? Is in a way a first. So someone can write 17 novels or 20 love story. But that person is specializing in that. So don't copy that person. Try and do something different. And try and have an original story. Try and have a story that you believe in, not a story which you think is going to sell or which is going to work in the market. That comes much later. I mean, if you aren't motivated to write, chances are you won't even finish the novel. If it's a novel, right? It's a short story, or if it's a 10-line poem, it's a different thing. If it's a 250-page or a 200-page novel, it's different.
What is your target audience? I understand you're trying to reach out to everybody, but if you would sum it up, what is your target audience?
I think the target audience for this particular book is anyone who is interested in current affairs, interested in politics, interested in the business of news and media and news making, regardless of age or background or where they're coming from, or regardless of whether they have any background or knowledge about Calcutta or not.
So I have a question. Your book focuses a lot on, say, political oppression and say, civil liberties. So are you trying to make a statement, or is there something beyond that that you're trying to advocate?
So, like I said, I'm not here on a mission, but yes, you will find incidents here which have occurred in India and which are very likely to occur again. So if you're thinking of something like land acquisition or land grabbing by land sharks or by international corporates with the government's backing, I mean, how familiar is that? It is familiar, right, in India. That has happened before and might happen again. So from that standpoint, I think it's at least dealing with the real issues that we are facing today. I'm not on a lecturing mode saying this is what should be done, this is what shouldn't be done. But yes, I'm dealing with issues which I think are real in today's context in India.
Any other questions?
So,
One last question.
every writer has an inspiration, like a personal inspiration, which simply makes the pen move. So what was your inspiration? Some piece of writing, some personal event?
Just fear. Time's passing by, I'm no longer young. And I wanted to write something before somebody else got that idea. Because every week I was like, oops, another 5 books coming out. And I think, but on a serious note, part of it was the motivation to write a thriller, which was, in the proper sense of the term, fast, and it's credible. It's fast, it's hard-hitting, it's credible, it's realistic, it's got characters who are real, who are flesh and blood. And when you read it, hopefully you'll be able to not identify with those, but you'll be able to believe that yes, people like this exist and things like this happen. So it was just the motivation of telling a good story.
Yeah, Ramjan's been jumping for the last 10 minutes.
So my question was to do with writing in itself. Usually there's a trade-off between the level of detail you would invest into a scene and the way the story sort of moves forward, right? And sometimes you'll for let's say a thriller, you might have to sacrifice some of the detail in which which you invest into the scene. And sometimes I've tried writing like that, and I found that it sort of feels hollow. How exactly do you enrich these fast-moving scenes by having this amount of detail, while of course not sacrificing the pace?
That I think is a very good question. It's a technical question, which which I would only expect from someone who's very serious about writing. So I do hope you don't give that part up. I'm serious, not lip service. Because you're talking about, you're going pretty deep into the modality of writing, and it's true. Because you can write a piece of very literary fiction like, Neil Mukherjee's Lives of Others, or something that Amitabh Ghosh writes, or Richard Flanagan writes, etc., right? And you can write a thriller. So where is the trade-off? I think what I can only speak from personal experience is what I've tried to do is, even when there is action, even when the pace picks up, the strategy that I've deployed is I have given details in describing the situation, in describing, person moving from point A to point B, what that person goes through. So there is space, but there is also detail. So I've tried not to sacrifice the detail. That's one part of it. And the other thing that I've done, and I don't want to give too many spoilers away, is that what I've done is not every chapter, right, is equally intense and equally brutal and violent, because then A, it's unsustainable, and B, it becomes unreadable. So what I've tried to do is have passages of that and then intersperse it with events or incidents which are on the face of it not related to that. So it's a bit of a counterpoint, and that's when you can bring out a little bit more of the detail, a little bit more of the literary piece, if you will.
Sir, in today's world of hypocrisy and show, many people, even youngsters, they turn to unreal fiction, like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So, as an author, what is your future? What are your future endeavors based on this fact? Like, people turn to fiction, unreal fiction. Like, if it is a thriller based on real life incidents. So, as a writer, what do you think? What do you do in the future? Books in which line? Which genre?
So are you talking about which kind of books I want to write in the future? Okay, right, good. So I didn't want to interrupt you because I wanted to give you a lot of time, and that because yesterday I think you were interrupted once every half a second in the jam session. You were participant number 6. 6?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. So that's why I was waiting. So that's brilliant. So that's why I wanted to give you more time. But I think that's a great question. And I don't want to limit myself, and I don't think any good writer should limit himself to any genre. Okay? So if the first book is about a political thriller and it's hard-hitting, etc., the next can be a spy story. Yeah? Or the one after that could actually be a love story. Or that love story, yeah. So I think you should look for, as a writer, you should look for stories which are real. You should look for stories that interest you and appeal to you. I mean, if you have a story in mind and you are not convinced about it, how on earth are you going to convince the reader to go through even the first 5 pages? It's as simple as that. I mean, you've got to believe in the story. That story has to interest you. It's that simple.
Okay, wrapping it up, as you can see, most of these people are engineering students and the rest of them are science. So, what would your advice be to them, considering that almost all of them are good writers and most of them take it very seriously? So, how to go from there? What's the next step? The last words.
I don't think being engineering students has anything which impedes them from writing or thinking creatively, right? So, my training was in economics, which isn't, depends. If you can juggle the figures of the GDP, then it's very imaginative and creative. But otherwise, right, it's not particularly artistic. And I'm in the IT field, and I'm in consulting. So for the last 18 to 20 years, that's pretty much all of my life has been. But I think the important thing is to be able to think creatively. And very often, I think the challenge with many of us is that we have ideas, but we run out of steam, and we run out of motivation. And I think the motivation has to come from within, or maybe a couple of very close friends. To be honest, right? I mean, if you're doing something with your writing, if you're publishing in the college journal, and then you're winning a prize at Verbum Maximus, and then your article or feature comes out in TOI, and then next it comes out in Hindu and so forth, then you don't need a lot of endorsement and encouragement. But it's when all of those things aren't happening, right? And you've still written a page or two that you believe in, that means something to you. That's when you have to nurture it, almost like a child.